Okay, good morning. We're going to continue today. Mir Tashem Perek Zayin, Mishnah Daled, Sanhedrin Perek Zayin, Mishnah Daled. This is a Mishnah that lists all those that are mechuyev skila, all the isurim in the Torah for which the punishment is skila. Says the Mishnah, Elu heinan iskolim. These are the ones who are sentenced to stoning. Parenthetically, the Mishnah is going to give the entire list of the mechuyove skila, and then the rest of the perek is going to delineate and explain more details about each one of these isurim and how it is that they must be transgressed in order to be mechuyev skila. That it we'll see in the rest of the perek. Elu henan iskolim. These are the ones who are sentenced to stoning. Someone who cohabits, someone who has relations with his mother, with his father's wife, that is to say, his father's wife who is not his mother, or with his daughter-in-law, hakala, or with another man, zechur, or with an animal, ve'ala behema. And furthermore, a woman who brings an animal unto herself, one who blasphemes the name of the Ribono Shel Olam. The Mishnah uses the term v'amegadef rather than hamekalel, because we don't want to use the term of cursing in regard to the Ribono Shel Olam, in regard to the divine name. One who worships an idol, one who gives one of his children to the Avodah Zarah of Moilech, a practice of the Knaanim. One who practices oiv and idoni, certain methods of communicating with the dead. One who violates Shabbos, one who does one of the 39 forbidden types of labor. One who curses his father or mother. One who cohabits with a betrothed nara. Right? In most cases, adultery is punished by strangling, but adultery with a betrothed nara, with a nara murosa, is punished by stoning, which is a harsher form of misa than strangling, as we learned previously in the Mishnah. V'amesis, one who persuades another person to worship an idol. V'amidiach, one who corrupts the residents of a town by persuading them to worship an idol. Right? Mesis is to an individual. Madiach is to an entire city. V'amechashef, one who performs magic. Uben Sora Umoire, the wayward son, the rebellious son, the Ben Sora Umoire, right, which will be the subject of Perek Ches. Now, the Mishnah discusses the first sin listed above, namely cohabiting with one's mother. So the Mishnah states that the punishment for someone who does this sin by mistake, for example, he did not realize who this woman was. So the Mishnah explains. Right, I said in the beginning that the Mishnah gives a list of the Mechuyove Skila, and then beginning from here on, for the rest of the Perek, the Mishnah discusses the given Isurim, the given Lavim, for which there's a Chiyuv Skila, one by one. If someone cohabits with his mother, who was once married to his father, but is now unmarried, and he cohabits with her, he must bring one chatas offering for the sin of cohabiting with his mother, and one chatas offering for the sin of cohabiting with his father's wife. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino chayav ela mishum ha'em bilvad. He only brings one chatas one chatas offering only for the sin of cohabiting with his mother. Rabbi Yehuda learns from a pasuk that one who cohabits with his mother brings an offering only for that sin, even if he commits other sins simultaneously at the same time. Okay, now you realize here that we're talking about a Baal Ha'im by mistake. Because if it was bemazid, knowingly, it's a mechuy of skila. But here we're talking about a Baal Ha'im, someone who cohabits with his mother who was once married to his father but is now unmarried by mistake. The next sin listed above in the Mishnah, namely cohabiting with the wife of one's father. A Baal Eishes Ha'av is someone cohabits with the wife of his father, who is still married to his father, but is not his mother. So if he cohabits with her by mistake, that is to say, he didn't know who this woman was. Chayav aleh mishum eishes av u'mishum eishes ish. He must bring one chatas for the sin of cohabiting with his father's wife, and a second chatas offering for the sin of cohabiting with a married woman. Now, although it's not stated in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with this ruling as well. Because again, he learns from another pasuk that the sinner must bring a chatas offering only for the sin of cohabiting with his father's wife, and not for the sin of cohabiting with a married woman. Which means if he already has to bring a chatas for cohabiting with his father's wife, so I feel if there's another isur simultaneously, there is no additional chatas. There is no additional chatas. And then the Mishnah explains that this, which we just said, chayav oleh mishum eishes av u'mishum eishes ish, says the Mishnah, bein b'chayi oviv, bein la'achar misas oviv. Cohabiting with one's father's wife is forbidden both during his father's lifetime as well as after his death. Why does the Mishnah have to tell us that? Because usually a married woman is forbidden to other men only as long as the marriage lasts. She's an eishes ish. But after the husband's death or their divorce, anyone may go ahead and marry her. However, the wife of a man's father remains forbidden to him even after her husband, that is to say his father, dies or divorces her. As the Mishnah is going to tell us later, the same is true regarding a man's daughter-in-law. She remains forbidden to her father-in-law even after her husband, that is his son, is no longer around. He passed away or he divorced her. So, bein b'chayi oviv, bein la'achar misas oviv. Bein min ha'erusin, bein min ha'nisuim. Both during their erusin period as well as during their nisuim. Right? There are two acts, there are two maisim that are needed for a marriage to take fully effect. The first act is called erusin, or kiddushin. That makes the chosin and the kala, the bride and the groom, married in most ways. For example, intimacy between the bride and another man is considered adultery. It's considered an eishes ish, and it's punished by misa. But they are forbidden to live together until they perform the second act of nisuyin, or hava lechupa. Right, in the olden times, we know that in the olden times, these two acts were performed a long time apart, perhaps even a year or so between them. Nowadays, they are performed usually together, one after the other, in a single ceremony, culminating in the chuppah. So the Mishnah says that again, the isur is bein b'chayi oviv, bein la'achar misas oviv, bein min ha'erusin, bein min ha'nisuim. Now the third sin listed above is cohabiting with one's daughter-in-law. A Baal kalos, so if one cohabits with his daughter-in-law who's still married to his son, cohabits with her again by mistake, b'shoigeg, Chayav aleh mishum kaloso and mishum eishesish. He brings one chatas for the sin of cohabiting with his daughter-in-law, and a second chatas for the sin of cohabiting with an eishesish, with a married woman. And here too, bein b'chaye b'noi, bein la'acham b'noi, as we mentioned a minute ago. Cohabiting with one's daughter-in-law is forbidden, both during the son's lifetime as well as after his death. Bein min ha'erusin, bein min ha'nistuim, both during the erusin and during the nistuim, as we saw a minute ago in the previous case. Now the Mishnah names the next three sins that were listed above in the Mishnah. That is, abo ala zochur v'la behema, a man who cohabits with another man or with an animal, as well as the third, v'ayisha mevias behema, a woman who brings an animal onto herself. That's posh. We understand. Zochur, behema, and isha mevias behema. Now the Torah in Vayikra Perek Chav tells us there that the animal involved in either of the last two acts, in the act of al behema and the act of isha mevias behema. So the Torah tells us that the animal involved in either of these two averos must also be put to death by stoning. So the Mishnah is explaining why is this so? What's the question? Says the Mishnah. I'll tell you what the question is. If the person sinned, in what way did the animal sin? Why are we stoning the behema? Says the Mishnah. Answer number one to this question is, we get rid of the behema. We get rid of the behema because a takola, an obstacle, a durchfall, a ruin, came to the person through this behema, through this animal. And leficha chomer hakosov tisakel. And therefore the Torah states that it should be stoned, it should be gotten rid of, so that others will also not sin with it as well. So explains the Tiferes Yisrael. That's what he says. Leficha chomer hakosov tisakel. The Torah tells us to get rid of it, so that others will also not be nichshal with this same behema. Davar acher, another explanation is that this animal must be executed. So it doesn't happen that the animal walks in the marketplace, and people will say, you see this behema? This is the animal for which Reuven got stoned. This is the animal that caused so-and-so to be stoned, which would bring additional shame onto the sinner. Again, an example that we've mentioned before, that the daila, enough with the punishment that the person has to get. Enough with the punishment that the person has to get. Don't need to add on any more bizyonis, any more shame, any more busha. The Torah is concerned, again, we see, with the dignity of the sinner, even after he has been executed. Continues Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah now continues to teach us about the next sin that was listed in the beginning of Mishnah Daled. What was the next sin in the Mishnah Daled? Amigadev, one who quote unquote blesses, in other words, someone who defames, who curses Rahman al-Itzlan, the name of the Ribbono Shel Olam. So the Mishnah tells us that one is not mechuyev misa. Eino chayav ad sheyafarish ish l'shem. He's not liable to execution unless he actually verbalizes, articulates, says beferush the name, the Shem Havaya, the name of the Ribbono Shel Olam, the name of God. Which means, for example, if he hears someone else say the name of God, someone else is uttering the name of God, and he then comes along and adds Rahman al-Itzlan, a curse, a defamation on God's name, then he's not put to death. He's not executed. because he did not say the Shem Hashem, because he was not mefarish the Shem Hashem. He's not put to death unless he uses the name of God to say that God's name should, so on and so forth. God's name should be, which means that the divine name that he cursed should strike, must be the special 4-letter name that begins with Yud K and ends with Vav K. Now the Mishnah continues that the court cannot punish the person unless witnesses, unless Eidim, tell the court exactly what he said. However, we have a problem. We don't want the witnesses to again have to repeat a curse of the Rebbeinu Shalom Keviyochel. So the Mishnah now explains. So how do we get this done? You need to have the Agodas Eidus. You need to have the Eidus of the Eidim. So they have to say what they heard. And what they heard was Megadef. Well, they can't repeat the Megadef. We don't want another person to repeat the Giduf. So Amar Rabbi Shua ben Kocha explained. I'll tell you how we deal with it. B'chol yom danin es ha'edim b'kinui. Every day of the trial, every day that we adjudicate this case of a Megadef, the Dayonim deal with the witnesses using a substitute for God's name. And they say, Yake Yoisi es Yoisi, Yake Yoisi es Yoisi. They ask the Eidim, did he say Yoisi should strike Yoisi? Using the term Yoisi in place of God's name. Why do they use the term Yoisi? Because it's a 4-letter it's a 4-letter name. Just like the name of the Rebbeinu Shalom, Yud Kei Vav Kei. And also because of its numerical value, which is 86, is the same as the numerical value of Elohim, one of God's name. So the Rav explains. So b'chol yom donin ha'edim b'kinu. Every day the Dayonim say to the Eidim, did he say Yaki Yosi es Yosi? Now, Nigmar Adin, but once the discussion, the deliberation is over, and the court is ready to rule that he's guilty, says the Mishnah, Lo yehorgim b'kinui. They cannot kill him based on using a substitute for God's name, because they must hear the witnesses repeat exactly what he said. Without their repeating exactly what he said, you can't go ahead and give him Isa, because it hasn't been corroborated per se. So what happens then? During the deliberations, during the Chakira, the Drisha v'Chakira, the back and forth, they can say Yosi ben Yosi. But once they have to psak din, they have to say the Shem Hashem b'furash. So what do? So they try to minimize the damage, minimize the desecration, minimize the Chilul Hashem. And therefore, Elam Motzim Kol Adam Lachutz. Rather, they send everyone out of the room so that the witnesses do not utter the curse that they heard in front of more people than necessary. And then, after they will moitzi everyone lachutz, they question the senior witness. Tell us, Abiyid. They say to him, say explicitly what you heard. Say explicitly what you heard this man say. And he says, he has to say it. This witness, the senior witness, repeats the curse word for word. And since he intends only to help the court, the Bezdin, fulfill its obligation to try this person, therefore he's allowed to say it. Otherwise he too would be committing an Isu. What happens then? What is the reaction? What is the response? The judges, upon hearing the curse, get up to their feet immediately, and they tear kriya. They tear their clothes, which they may never sew back again. Lo means they can never re-sew that kriya that they just tore for hearing the giduf of Hashem Yisborach's name. What about the second witness? The second witness says, I too heard the same thing as he did, which means he doesn't repeat now the giduf. One person, one witness only, the first witness is allowed to say it, and the second witness, I also heard it. And the Shlishi Omer, the third witness, if there is another witness, he also says, I too heard the same thing as he did. And if there are more witnesses who heard it, they too say the same thing, which means they too cannot repeat the giduf, can only say, I heard like the first fellow said. The first fellow said the actual giduf. Which means that although the person can be put to death based on the testimony of al pi shnayim eidim, of two witnesses, but if there are more witnesses there, they all must testify. Because the Tana of our Mishnah holds that if one witness is disqualified, the defendant cannot be punished even if two valid witnesses remain. So is the discussion in the Gemara Makos in the beginning of the first parak of Makos, which means all the witnesses must therefore testify, so that if one witness or his testimony is disqualified, the defendant will be spared from Misa. And that's what the Mishnah says, Vashen Yomer, Vashlish Yomer. What do you have to tell me about the Shlishi and on? You only need two witnesses. The teretz is, if there are more witnesses who witnessed this defamation, then each witness must be consistent with what the first witness has testified. If one witness is out, no misa.